Hello, and welcome back to our channel. In today's episode, we'll travel far beyond the boundaries of civilization, from open seas to a vast wilderness. So, hit the subscribe button and let's explore the unknown together.
Once, we were coyote hunting and had been at it for about 4 hours. We decided that it was time to start a fire because it was snowing and we were freezing. After we lit the fire and about another hour had passed, we heard a few coyotes about 40 feet in front of us. We got our spotlight and shined it to find about 20 pairs of eyes to our front, and what we thought was about 40 feet was only about 15. My friend turned around with the light, and they were everywhere. We were completely surrounded by these things by the time they had made any noise. We were about to start shooting at them in the hopes of bagging a couple and scaring the rest of them off. As we were just about to fire, we heard a bang from about 100 yards behind us. It turns out it was another hunter, and he didn't see us in the horde of coyotes. At that point, we hit the ground, so we didn't get inadvertently hit, and started firing in the direction opposite of the other hunter. I got 4 coyotes, and my friend got 3. The other hunter got an unknown amount. Coyotes don't normally act like that, and they have been very aggressive ever since. We never saw who the other hunter was for sure, but it was a small town, so we had a good guess of who else might be back there. Thinking back on it, we could have died from several different things that night. We could have been shot, hypothermic, or even attacked by coyotes. We were scared shitless when we first saw them all. From 1995 to 2004, my family and I used to live at various tea estates in the northern part of West Bengal, India. Normally the managers, assistant managers, etc. live in British-era bungalows in the middle of the estates, so there's just this one house with possibly several kilometers of tea bushes. Plus, that area is intermingled with forests housing leopards, panthers, and the like. Cobras and other snakes are standard procedure. The worst thing was that all around there were just bushes of tea, forming an opaque layer of green, and you'd have no idea what was roaming underneath. Very often, when driving home from Saturday club meetings, we'd sometimes witness a jaguar casually walk across the road. Once, a colleague of my father was on his bike traveling alone when a leopard leapt from the bushes, used him as a platform, and jumped into the bushes on the other side. His shoulders bore deep cuts from the claws. Apart from terrifying animal encounters, you had your ghost stories. A bungalow that my family stayed in at the Diana Tea Estate was particularly notorious. I don't know if it had a backstory, but people were really afraid of it. Guests we had at the house could never switch the lights off to sleep. Once, we had an uncle of mine stay there, and he swore that someone kept pulling the blanket away repeatedly during the night. There were also giant snails in the bathroom. Creepy as fuck, emo. Throughout most of this, I was a little kid, so I guess personally, I haven't had an experience like that. Even if I did, I doubt I'd identify it as one. I wouldn't live there alone now as an adult, for sure. Let me throw in this one as a bonus. This did happen, I'm sure, but I'll have to Google a fair bit if you guys want a source, because it's a story told to me in about 2008 or 2007 by a friend of my dad, and it took place not long before that. Okay, so at tea estates, there are very often conflicts between the management and the laborers, or the laborers and the tribals, and the like. Shit can get violent fast. I remember when we had to stay at a hotel in Shiliguri because our estate was locked down because of a conflict between the laborers and the management. Anyway, this guy used to work at a tea estate that came into conflict with the tribals. One night, when he was driving home with his wife, the tribals stopped him midway and killed them both, chopping their bodies. I was on a trip in rural Bayan-Ulgi, Western Mongolia. For perspective, we were about a day's drive from the nearest town and several days from an actual city. It was about -10 that night, and my friends and I slept in a small ger with a Mongolian family. I went outside to go to the toilet in the middle of the night. I had way too many beers in the evening. Seriously, there's nothing else to do. It was pitch black, and there was not a light as far as the eye could see. There were no toilets, but I found a comfortable place to squat where I hopefully wouldn't slip and land with my bare bum in the snow. I did this once before. It was way less funny than it sounds. It was perfectly silent. Until it wasn't. I heard something moving around behind me. I tried my best to ignore it and get back inside as fast as I could. I was more worried about being out in the cold in my pajamas than the sound. But it got closer and closer. I looked around and saw nothing. Then, I turned around again, and all I could see were 2 big eyes about 5 centimeters from my face and some scary ass horns. It came right up, nearly touching me, but I couldn't see it until it was literally in my face. Naturally, I freaked out and tried to pull my pants up and get the hell away, kind of stumbling around in the snow. Anyway, it turns out it was just a curious yak I had woken up, but I didn't go out for a midnight wee for the rest of the trip. After 2014 I was in the outback of Australia, as a tourist, bushwalking with 3 other people. I have never been out hiking before and have never spent a night in a tent. We had driven by car for like 2-3 hours from Canberra to a place called Selwyn Snowfields, where we started our trek. The first day, we walked like 13 to 14 kilometers or so, right into the wilderness. There was no civilization as far as the eye could see, only the forest trail we were walking on. Darkness approached quickly, so we decided to stop, put up our tents, and make a fire. There wasn't really any flat ground to put up a tent, so for a moment we considered putting our tents on the little forest road that we walked on. Well, it wasn't really a road, more like 2 tire tracks, but at least it was a little bit more flat than the surroundings. We couldn't even in our wildest imagination think that somebody else would come along that road, especially during the night. But anyway, we decided to set up our tents a couple of steps to the side of the road. It gets pitch black, I see the Milky Way for the first time in our lives, and we cook and eat our food. It is dead silent, the only thing we can hear is the fire. It is pitch black, the only lights are from the moon and the stars. We had set up camp quite high, so we could see really, really far, but still, we couldn't see any lights at all in any direction. We go to bed at like 10 o'clock or so, maybe. As it was my first night sleeping in a tent, I had problems falling asleep, so I was awake for probably an hour or so before I started hearing some really faint noise really far away. I lay still, listening to it for a couple of minutes. It sounds like it is getting closer. After a couple of minutes, I am 100% sure it is coming closer, and I can hear twigs breaking. After a few more minutes, I can hear that it's a truck coming. It must be coming along the little road we were sleeping just a couple of steps away from. Suddenly, my whole tent lights up, and I can hear the car really close by. He slowly passes by our tents and drives away. Scary as fuck. Also, 2 days later, when we were even further into the wilderness, we stopped in the evening after walking around 23 kilometers that day. We were in a really beautiful valley, and some people in the group wanted to stop there and make camp for the night. I said, let's go a little bit further so we can get out of the valley, because it will probably be colder at night down in the valley, and I had been freezing pretty badly the previous nights. I managed to convince them, and we walk for about 2 kilometers. We get out of the valley and find a nice high ground looking over the valley, and we have a stream of fresh water just a minute away. After we had eaten dinner, we went to bed, and shortly after, I started hearing wolves, wild dogs, or something similar. I don't know if they have wolves down in Australia, but I heard some animals howling down in the valley for 10 to 15 minutes or so. It scared me shitless, and I was just hoping and praying that those animals would stay down in the valley, where we had previously considered making camp. Thankfully, they stayed down in the valley. I don't know what we would have done if they decided to attack us because we had no weapons at all, not even a hatchet. I was late to the party but a little off topic. Regardless, I was alone too. I was abroad in a third world country. There is a folklore saying that if one ever gets lost, he or she just needs to turn their shirts inside out to not get disoriented. So I was doing jogs across the town, and it's early in the morning, about 5 or 6 a.m. Hills looked blue, the sky looked ashy and dark, and it was beautiful. I kept jogging, and for a minute, I started on my road or path to just concentrate on running. Hearing my foot pound and tap the pavement, tap, tap, tap. I looked up, and I was disoriented because I had no idea where I was. Prior to this, I'd jogged about 3 times and done a lap back to the village, but this place was a little different. There were also trucks and cars that passed by, but I couldn't tell who the drivers looked like. Kept running and suddenly walked into a small lot with a bunch of houses. I looked around, and there was a frumpy grandma in some stand just staring at me. I was like, WTF are you looking at, the fuck? So I got creeped out and ran out of that little venue. Then I felt very lost, looked back, and the venue was still there with the old houses. I was lost. But I remembered that folklore thing, took my shirt inside out, and once I popped my head out, I was pretty far from the town. I had to run back to it because I freaked out. I used to live on a farm out in rural Queensland, Australia. It was 10,000 acres, and the nearest town had maybe 200 people. There was a floating population of farm workers there, and I was friends with the caretaker's kids, so when my parents split up, I moved there for a while. Sometimes I'd be there on my own for a night or 2 at a time when supply runs and stuff were needed. One of these nights, I got drunk and woke up at sunrise. The house was pretty large and had a long sunroom going down one side. I could see into it from the lounge, where I'd fallen asleep. On one end of the table in there, I saw what I thought was one of the older farm workers smoking. He seemed to be looking towards me, but he didn't make any sound. I remember the light of the cigarette quite clearly. I got up and looked away while I was stretching. When I looked back after 10 to 15 seconds, the guy was gone. I thought he'd gotten up and wandered down to the other end of the house. I went after him, couldn't find him, and decided that he'd gone outside. I went and fed the animals, etc., and around midday some of the crew came back. The old guy was with them, not working on another area of the farm like I thought he'd been. Turns out, the farmer who'd owned the place 3 generations ago or something died of a heart attack while smoking somewhere near that side of the house, apparently. I never spent a night there alone again. A couple of years ago I was hiking in the New Forest, UK, not the most secluded place in the world, I know, but relative to England, when my friend and I decided to cut through a bit of dense wood to a trail on the far side, a mile or 2 away. We'd been all over parts of the forest on various hikes and stuff before, so we didn't think anything of it. About halfway through, we were following a small brook when the forest got very silent. Much like a few other posters on here, we came across a campsite that looked like it had been abandoned a few weeks earlier. The tent flap was open, and sleeping bags were still inside. A book was open, face down, on the ground. A gas stove with cold, congealed food in the pan was still there, all covered in a layer of fallen leaves. Weirdest of all, a very clean and new-looking moped was parked next to the stream, but it was again covered in a week or so of leaves. Just a regular road-use moped with wheels the size of small plates. How on earth it got miles off the road through dense and hilly forest, I don't know. The silence and weird objects were creepy, we both got a deep sense of unease, so we decided to bail quick, as we didn't feel quite safe until we were back on the path and in sight of another party some time later. I was around 13 years old at my grandparents' house. We were in the backyard, enjoying a bonfire. Their house is surrounded by woods and such, and it's smack in the middle of a nice plot of 4 acres. They essentially owned a chunk of forest, best of all, their neighbors did too, and we were allowed on their property and such to play on the trails and in the woods. Anyway, it's getting dark. My father, my 2 brothers, and my mother are around the bonfire when we hear coyotes howling in the distance. We heard this often enough to understand what it was and where it was coming from. But this night was different. A few minutes later, the howling was closer. We start cracking jokes about how they're hunting us and stuff, which we know isn't true because coyotes are more afraid of you than you are of them. But then we hear howling from the opposite direction. Around an hour later, we can hear howling in every direction and see eyes and the flashes of the fire around the edge of the woods. My parents are taking it easy, but me and my brothers were a little on edge but interested as fuck. We stayed out there until the howling stopped. After that, we put out the fire, went inside, and slept. This wasn't the weirdest thing that happened, but it came pretty damn close. My family and my mom's friend's family both decided to go on a trip. I can't remember where the destination was exactly, but the setting of this story is somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. We reached a campsite in our big brown van and eventually headed for bed. My mom, my brother, and I slept in our van parked on a very small, 20x20 plateau. This is the part of the story where I was sleeping the whole time, but my brother and mom were awake for it all. I was probably 9 years old. According to my brother, a group of hooded people approached our van and tried to get in. They banged on the door for about a minute straight, and once they realized they couldn't get in, they tried something else. They tried pushing our van off the hill. The van rocked back and forth and would have eventually tipped over and fallen off the edge of the hill had my brother not started yelling and screaming at them. I think about this every once in a while and I'm just happy to be able to miss it all. Experiencing something like that as a small child would have scared the snot out of me. Just this Sunday, actually, I was sleeping about a half mile from Crater Lake near the Maroon Bells, Aspen, Colorado. I was all alone and sleeping under the stars, a very good recipe for being on edge. Around 4 a.m., I hear a sound like someone playing a kazoo. And this sound is moving down the trail. It being 4 a.m., my first guess is someone trying to make noise to keep bears away, but that made little sense, as sunrise wasn't for another few hours, and anyone who wanted an early start on one of the many surrounding mountains would have no reason to start so early. It being 4 a.m., my next guess is that it is a serial killer trying to draw out victims, so I decide to stay in my sleeping bag. The kazoo noise keeps getting closer until it is about 10 feet away. This is odd, since though there is a trail leading to my sleeping area, it is of the unofficial kind, and you would have to be looking to find it. I hadn't heard any footsteps, so I wasn't as scared as I might have been when I turned on my flashlight to find the biggest fucking porcupine I have ever encountered, by at least a factor of 3. Being a porcupine, It did not give a shit that it had been noticed and gave me the most humorously dismissive look I have ever encountered from an animal. And kept on ambling down towards the creek, still making kazoo noises. Until I was back home and could look up which animals made kazoo noises, I had convinced myself that it was a wolverine, since it was closer in size to a normal wolverine than a normal porcupine. One interesting thing is that the porcupines in the area are mostly black with scattered white quills. This one was the opposite, and by the light of the stars and my flashlight, it looked like a ghost. I have no problem seeing the origin of any ghost stories in the area. I rode a bike across the country by myself this past summer, and it was one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. I went from Yorktown, Virginia, to San Francisco, California, and I've never felt more isolated in my life than taking back roads through Utah and Nevada, where the terrain is unforgiving and civilization is spread by almost 90 miles at times. One day, in Utah, it hit 108 degrees Fahrenheit, so I decided to wait until nighttime to ride. On this night, I was set to go through Capitol Reef, a canyon in Utah that is really something spectacular to see, especially around sunset. Well, since I rode through at night, all I had for light was my cheap headlight and the moon. At times, I would just ride by moonlight, which was really cool to do. While trying to see what was on the other side of a field at one point, my headlamp found 4 sets of coyote eyes staring back at me from the roadside. When you see one coyote, it's not a big deal, they're pretty skittish, but still, it gets your heart going. But when you see groups of coyotes, they're hungry and willing to take chances on something bigger. Even so, 4 isn't too much to worry about. This was another one of those situations where all the comfort of statistics was thrown straight out of the window and dead set fear kicked in. It's one thing to be at a rest stop by your car and to see this, it's entirely another thing when you don't have a comforting metal cage to jump back into and when the only comfort you have is a dull utility knife. And that vulnerability of being trapped in a canyon with these coyotes on a back road in Utah at 2 in the morning is not something I will soon forget, but it is one of the most powerful memories I have of the trip and something I wouldn't change for the world. Strangest was being in a forest here in the Netherlands, behind a camping site. It has a valley where a stream runs with small bridges and such. During the day, it's a beautiful place, but when it gets dark, it's a creepy place. In 2003, me and one of my nephews were messing around in the valley, from scratching our names and dates in the trees to messing about in the streams, until we noticed once in a while little pebbles falling near us. It is a valley, not with a lot of bush or plants, so whoever did it had to be standing on the top on the side where the camping was. At one moment, I heard this sound of a pebble hitting my nephew's head. He sat there in pain, and we waited for the next pebble to land and ran up the valley slope within 10 seconds to see who was messing with us. Nobody was to be seen. We could easily look into the forest for 50 meters but didn't see anyone. We did some hide and seek a day later at dusk. I found a good spot, and I heard the sound of something falling next to me. It was another pebble, completely covered in mud, like it had been pulled from the stream 2 meters away from me. There were no fingerprints on the thick clay mud. 5 minutes later, my nephew found me, and we walked back to the campsite, where it was already pitch black. Suddenly behind us, we heard this ghoulish sound coming up. It sounded like breathing in through an open mouth and going wow. It scared us so much that we ran out of those woods and onto the camping grounds and into our cabin and never came back there for vacation.